Why did Python win? I started programming in 2013 in JavaScript. I've since learned and tried a handful of languages, including Python, but JavaScript was always my favorite. Just within the last year I learned Ruby, and I was blown away by how fun and easy to use it is. At the present time, I'm starting all my new projects in Ruby. My impression is that in the noughties, Python and Ruby were both relatively new, dynamically typed, English-like languages. And for a while these languages had similar popularity. Now Ruby is still very much alive, there are plenty of Rails jobs available and exciting things happening with Ruby itself. But Python has become a titan in the last 10 years. It has continued to grow exponentially and Ruby has not. I can guess as to why. Python's math libraries, NumPy and Pandas, make it appealing to academics. Python is simpler and possibly easier to learn. Rails was so popular that it was synonymous with Ruby, but I wasn't paying attention at that time. So I'm interested in hearing from some of the older programmers about why Ruby has stalled out and Python has become possibly the most popular programming language, when, in my opinion, Ruby is the better language. Python ended up specializing in data contexts, thanks to NumPy, Pandas, and as a result, ended up becoming the first exposure to programming than anyone doing data stuff had. That was millions of people. In that space, it had no competitors. Ruby ended up specializing in web dev, because of Rails. But when Node and React came out, Ruby on Rails had to compete with Node.js plus React, MERN as a way of building a web app. Since people first learning programming to build a web app would usually start with JavaScript anyway, since a lot of very first projects might not even need a backend, it was a lot easier for the Node.js/React route to become the default path. Whereas if you were a data scientist, you started on Python, and as you got better, you basically just kept using Python. I think Python was popular as a general-purpose language first. After all, there was a reason people put so much effort into writing NumPy in the first place. I think a lot of people were attracted to the language design, as captured in the Zen of Python, such as explicit is better than implicit. Readability counts. Errors should never pass silently, unless explicitly silenced. There should be one and preferably only one obvious way to do it. In many cases, Ruby has almost the opposite philosophy. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think a lot of people prefer Python's choices. NumPy is certainly amazing, but there are tons of competitors in the data/scientific space, which pure A-type data scientists tend to prefer, R, SSPS, MATLAB. The difference is that Python doesn't entirely suck as a general-purpose language. Sure, you might have better options, but it's still reasonable to write almost anything in Python. Other scripting languages like Ruby, Js and Lua are probably a little bit better when evaluated strictly on their merits as programming languages, but they lack the ecosystem. In other words, it might be inelegant, slow, a mess, whatever, but the concept behind it is basically correct. I agree with these as major points. A few other secondary ones. Ruby was primarily maintained in Japanese, so had a barrier to entry for language level issues. It also lacked English language evangelists and university presence. When Ruby was new, invented 1995, Python had some older design issues, as it was 6 years older. However, it really recovered and implemented a lot of change through Python 2, 2000, and Python 3, 2008. Though there were compatibility issues in the short term, and in the long term this change worked out. Ruby inherited from Perl timetouty, there is more than one way to do it, philosophy which is a little more at odds with the scientific community. Greater than Python ended up specializing in data contexts, thanks to NumPy, Pandas. Yeah, it was a success 20 years in the making, had a fair amount of input from science men, and that being GVR's background he responded positively. For example, the extended slices, striding, and ability to index with an unparenthesized tuple, multidimensional indexing, were very much added for the convenience of NumPy's ancestors. I would not say it had no competition. Perl used to be quite popular in at least some SciComp fields. I want to say bioinformatics, but I'm probably wrong. This is part of it, but the reasons go back further. As others have mentioned, Python is a pretty old language. It debuted as Python in 1991, even before Linux was out, and it existed as ABC even in the late 80s. It had a very good, easy-to-use API early on. Combining that with the way it can load shared object files as modules and the ability to create user-defined operators and effectively extend the default syntax allowed it to mimic both MATLAB with SciPy and NumPy and R's data.frame with pandas, which is a huge part of why it attracted all the people from scientific computing and data analytics. The API to the major packages was nearly identical to what they were already familiar with from before. It's not an array language on its own, but the ability to redefine operators and the fact that array indexing is itself an operator made it possible to turn it into an array language. The fact that all of these packages can easily just wrap existing BLAS and LAPACK implementations made it very fast for these purposes. That also happened pretty early. NumPy came out in the 90s. But even before that, Python and Perl were about the only two scripting languages other than the shell that was guaranteed to be present on a GNU/Linux system from the start. That made it really popular to create high-level system utilities in Python. A whole lot of the util Linux packages, libvirt, the apt packaging system, all make heavy use of Python. So it's not just the academics already familiar with it, but system administrators and hackers, too. It also gained widespread popularity as a teaching language alternative to Java. Once MIT started using it in their Intro to Programming course and put that on the internet via OCW, it really took off as many people's first exposure to programming. The batteries included approach to the standard library makes it very usable for one-off automation tasks, too. I don't even like Python that much, but the other day I was doing some math work and just needed to compute a bunch of binomials and enumerate subset combinations. You want to look up how to do that in your language of choice. Python just as math.factorial and itertools.combinations in the standard library. If you're using Linux or Mac, you already have it. It may not be a great choice for application development, but if you need to do some quick, interactive tasks that are never going to get deployed or even necessarily stored on disk as files but just run once from the REPL, and it's too much for your calculator app or Excel to handle, Python is perfect. Not only math/academia, but nearly everywhere. As Python started coming pre-installed on Mac OS and was a lot easier than fumbling with shell scripts, a lot of scripts were being written to automate boring stuff. Also, the hidden beast is Django and Flask, which are also being commonly used by both serious and non-serious folks, overall increasing the user base. Also, Python is less verbose compared to Java, C#, Scala, JavaScript pre-ES6 etc., in terms of syntax, so it is much easier to learn and can do both OOP and functional, while being easier to adapt. No compiler, easy installation, lots of popular libraries, hence academia picked it up. Also, Python has built-in parallel processing features which are less daunting in terms of concepts and syntax than other competitors C++/Java etc. See the popularity of Go, same thing happened with Python. I think you're describing a symptom, popularity in data contexts, rather than a cause. If you're looking for causes, makes a good case the answer is PEP 3118. There is a lot more history before the data part. But yes, it is a big modern driver for its popularity, and Python owes it to its easy C interop. I would contest the Ruby as web dev part, though. I used Ruby for Puppet and Vagrant a long time ago and it was great, but all my experiences with Rails, and associated gems, turned into maintenance nightmares. As a Python programmer in the 2x days, I think data science happened fortuitously to counteract the exodus over the 2 greater than 3 transition. For a long time, it felt to me like Python was on the way out because of the changes. It's not because of data science, it's popular for the same reason Java is popular, it's what they teach in schools. It's a virtuous cycle, industry adoption grows school adoption, which grows industry adoption. That's a fascinating wrong way to look at history. Python has no specializing. It always played strong on many popular fields. From the early days, it had a strong leaning to science, after all that's where it came from. But at the same time it also had a strong stance in Unix areas and established itself as a good tool for sysadmins, competing with Perl and Bash. And at the same time it also had strong bindings with other languages, gave it early on the fame of a glue language. It also dabbled early in web stack and networks and had too many web stack option to gain that one framework fame, like Ruby on Rails. Python just was the language which allowed you to play on all the important fields, with simplicity, even with some level of speed. This was something other languages lacked. They either were complicated, or slow, or lacking support for specific areas. Python just somehow acquired them all, and had a big impact on a broad area, which made it so popular, because for the majority of use cases it was a natural option. Good answer. Python is, imho, not a very good language. But it has a few great libraries which led to overwhelming momentum and inertia. In a cruel twist of irony, those libraries are probably written in C. I'll argue that Python is very alive in the system management/scripting space. Because of the library support, especially for data, it's also popular as API servers. It's not as popular for entire applications but is still very active. Edit, Django is actually about equal or more popular than Node.js based on Google Trends. Not sure that means anything, as I'd how many people Google Node.js when working on it. Greater than Python ended up specializing in data contexts. There's a big subcontinent of data stuff in the Python ecosystem, but Python the language hasn't specialized there. I'd argue, it has enabled the third-party number crunching and data libraries like NumPy and Pandas, but not specialized over other domains where Python is used. Python doesn't compare to R for analytical work. It doesn't have the ecosystem, and R is specialized for it. Where Python broke in was machine learning, which is not analytical work and often involves lots of general-purpose programming. Sklearn, Skimage, OpenCV, TensorFlow, Torch, JAX, and so on are often used in a general code base. Torch was actually a C++/Lua framework initially before switching to C++/Python. Python has a dominant general-purpose ecosystem. It's also a simple language to learn compared to R/MATLAB/ etc., which are just horrible to use for data structures or paradigms other than vector/matrix-based pipelines. I think that data science and web competition is at least 80%, but I'm going to throw out a few possible ideas that I haven't seen mentioned that may have helped. Maybe I'm way off base though. Udacity's popularity. Its first few free courses were Python. I believe they advertised as a way to get into Google. Not sure how many people got into Google via Udacity though. LeetCode, job interviews. Maybe I'm way off here as I don't do these, but from what I've read, people who spend a lot of time on these prefer Python because the syntax and libraries often give a speed and simplicity advantage. Lots of devs had to install Python to use some utility or tool someone else created. Maybe it all came down to the decision to fuse Python's numeric and NumArray libraries into NumPy, providing a unified fast MATLAB-like library, which ended up being a great fit to a lot of data science use cases. Python also had a near-death experience with the Python 2 to Python 3 transition. It could have wound up like Perl did with Perl 6, but I think the data science use case really made it. Overall, I think Python is the best language for the non-professional programmer, who wants to script things and put their skills on wheels. Python specialized in ease of learning and running the code. Everything else came after as a byproduct of the large user base. One reason why I switched our team from MATLAB to Python was the capabilities of the core libraries. ArgParse alone sold it for us. The way I, somewhat hazily, remember it, Python was mainly competing with Perl as a scripting language, not Ruby as an application/web language. I started hearing about Ruby years later when Ruby on Rails drove the Web 2.0 movement, but that feels like a different era to me. Eric S. Raymond wrote an article in 2000 about his experience trying Python after spending a lot of time with Perl. I'll quote some of it here. Greater than when you're writing working code nearly as fast as you can type and your misstep rate is near zero, it generally means you've achieved mastery of the language. But that didn't make sense, because it was still day one and I was regularly pausing to look up new language and library features. Greater than this was my first clue that, in Python, I was actually dealing with an exceptionally good design. Most languages have so much friction and awkwardness built into their design that you learn most of their feature set long before your misstep rate drops anywhere near zero. Python was the first general-purpose language I'd ever used that reversed this process. 1. I think a good part of the issue is that right around then, Perl decided to do Perl 6. People decided to wait on doing anything big, since Perl 6 wouldn't be quite compatible. Later it turned out to be extremely incompatible. And Perl 5 would be dead long term, so why spend time on it, when you'd have to do a radical rewrite soon? Meanwhile, Python was there. And Perl 6/Raku took 15 years to finally arrive in some form, by which point Python had completely eaten its lunch. This is an accurate explanation. I started to teach myself Python just before 2000. The general consensus before then was that for a first language Perl or Python would be a good choice. Python was typically preferred because it was more approachable than Perl, i.e. more succinct. With no prior programming experience, besides manually typing out programs into my C64 as a kid, I managed to build a program that connected to my web page hosted by my ISP and changed a link in a page to point to a web server I was running on my PC by just referring to the standard documentation. That's one point that doesn't get mentioned, I think. The standard documentation was clear and accessible in a variety of formats. Also, Python on Windows was very easy to set up. This comment was very helpful. Part of my question is why Python was used as a successor to Perl and not Ruby, but it sounds like Python was established as a competitive scripting language 5 years before people were talking about Ruby. I can't find it now, but there was another comment that pointed out that the languages weren't contemporaries. That's a nice way to put it. I get the same feeling with Python. I pick it up now and then and I always seem to get it to do exactly what I need real fast. It just works, has a library for what you need, and its usage is clearly explained in English in the docs. Compare that to Go, for example, the other language I know, and it's not even close. Greater than when you're writing working code nearly as fast as you can type and your misstep rate is near zero, it generally means you've achieved mastery of the language. But that didn't make sense, because it was still day one and I was regularly pausing to look up new language and library features. This really jives with my experience. I learned Ruby first and used it as my scripting language of choice for years, but I constantly found myself having to look up how to do even the most basic tasks. A day or two after learning Python I was already as productive as I had been with Ruby. It was wild. This isn't so much a jab at Ruby, just that Python worked the way I thought a programming language should, which made everything easy. I think it's kinda nonsense. No programming language is intuitive. It's arcane by nature. Having slightly more concise syntax saves you maybe a week of learning time. I used to write Perl about as fast as I could think because I had a lot of practice with it. I mostly do Python now, but do a lot less coding in general and I have to Google syntax constantly. Python is less noisy, But it's not really more intuitive for me. Frankly, I think language design is secondary to IDE integration. The only time I've ever coded without thinking at all was using Java with IntelliJ or C# with Visual Studio. Type matching and library introspection all work flawlessly 99% of the time. Not only do I not need to know the details of syntax, but I didn't even need to know APIs because I could autocomplete everything all the time. Python with Versus code still feels Stone Age by comparison. The quotation is so true. There was a Python WTFs posted recently which was fun, but the thing is you could work with Python successfully for years without ever running into them. Contrast that with other languages where you need to learn the WTFs before you can stop writing buggy code. Ruby was never similar in popularity to Python. It was just a fad in web dev circles. I've rarely seen Ruby before raw, and I've seen Python all over. Python was popular as a teaching language, how it gained a foothold in academia. I remember 20 years ago, when I was starting out, it was popular for game scripting. Lua was more embeddable, but Python was also used. Plenty of first-class interfacing methods to native code. Still remember C++ Boost shipping Python binding generator. Many tools shipped Python as an embedded scripting language. Python was used for creating build systems. Not to mention any distro out there ships Python. It replaced Perl in that regard. Batteries included and being available helped it become the norm for random scripting. Python was big before NumPy/ML. I'll bite on just a fad in web dev circles, in case you are serious and not trolling. Rails World is celebrating the 20th anniversary of Rails this year. As I'm sure you know, Rails is built on Ruby. 20 years does not fit my definition of fad. Greater than many tools shipped Python as an embedded scripting language. I had dabbled with Python before encountering it, in its embedded form, but once I started using it inside Esri's ArcGIS software, it became my go-to language for many, many tasks. I first bumped into Python because Mailman was written in it. It was a large, slow and a bit funny. I saw it as another odd academic language that had spilled out of a university somewhere. Then in about 2005 I heard about Zope, and how easy and wonderful it was compared to PHP. But it was slow and memory heavy. In about 2008 more and more stuff started getting Python bindings, specifically in VFX, where I was working. There was a tussle between JavaScript and Python won out, even displacing Mel and other domain-specific languages. Ruby was always more obscure to me. It was for people that liked C and wanted a more Perl-y version of it, but without the anarchy or the universality of CPAN. I think the biggest reason was that it had loads of stuff in the standard lib, way more than anything else at the time. Much more than Perl, so it meant that things were a bit more portable. So people came for the stlib, then started adding things to it because they'd spent all that time learning it. There's a joke that is roughly Python is not the best language for any particular task, but is nearly always the second best language for that task. It's a jack-of-all-trades language. Because of this, lots of people learned Python, and then applied it in many different areas, and it just became more prevalent and useful. I think that's part of the answer. Python has multiple independent communities of use: web, data science, ML, DevOps. Most languages only have one or two ecosystems of use. I think the other part of Python's success compared to J's is a better story about C integration. Python itself is just a series of macros to make C nicer to use, which meant the existing C++ ecosystem was relatively easy to integrate. And then the SciPy world also brought in Fortran. J's is huge on the back-end web, but it hasn't spread into other ecosystems nearly as much because the C integration story isn't as good. Greater than Python is not the best language for any particular task. Python basically solved this problem by wrapping around C code that's far more performant, but still exceptionally simple to leverage due to Python's simple syntax. Llama CPP has C++ in its name, yet its most popular platform is Python. So for certain applications, Python because the undisputed number one. Because it was C in disguise, with better usability. With parallelization, Python having 100x slower loops became an old problem. 2023's coding paradigm is if you're using loops, you're doing it wrong. People love complaining about pandas, but Dask solved all the single core problems in 2021. Greater than? Amen. Greater than Python is not the best language for any particular task, but is nearly always the second best language for that task, pointing out any problem where speed is the difference between working and unusable. For example, ray tracing is probably too cheap a shot, as it's not like Ruby or Perl are any better in that regard, and Lua-JIT came too late to be relevant to the current question. One range of problems where I've found Python, unextended by a code generator, to be surprisingly awful, though, is everywhere the ML style of algebraic data types plus pattern matching is natural, compilers, basically, all the way down to a regex engine. There's just no comparison. Maybe things have changed now that match exists. I've not yet had the time to try, even if the double indentation doesn't make me hopeful. Definitely a jack of all trades language. And when you get older, and you care more about solving problems than about trying new things, and you've got more responsibilities in life and lack the time to devote to learning new language, technology du jour, then knowing and using Python becomes so handy. If it is indeed the second best language for the job, it is still a decent choice if you get to solve the problem. Yeah, it's a good enough especially to start poking around many accounts of people dropping other languages with better perf or semantics to use Python as a prototyping ++ tool. It was a trend in many Dinlangs, PHP and others, where you'd write the core in it and drop to C for hot loops. Python is better than PHP, it has some metaprogramming, hello PLOS, to mold it syntactically wise, good enough sglib, low enough semantic warts. Than and NumPy/pandas for non-Sweng crowds. Greater than Python is not the best language for any particular task, but is nearly always the second best language for that task. The second best language is false, it's just usable for a wide variety of tasks. Just like many other languages, but specifically not Ruby. I was there when it happened, I remember it well. Python displaced Perl, when Perl was a dominant scripting language, way back in the 1990s. What motivated people to replace Perl with Python, is that we started using scripting languages for serious software with non-trivial complexity. In this context, Python was much more scalable and maintainable language than Perl, it was just an easier scripting language for software engineering purposes. I used to write apps in Perl and moved to Python for the same reason everyone else did. At the time this was happening, neither Ruby nor JavaScript were credible alternatives, Python won by default. The only other scripting language I can remember being used in similar contexts at the time was TCL. The other half of it is that Python had a great C binding story, which made it easy to integrate Python with almost everything since CABI was the lingua franca of interoperability. You could wrap high-performance code in a thin layer that would allow you to efficiently script it in Python. This is why Python became ubiquitous in HPC/supercomputing decades ago. It allowed Python to have a vast library of functionality with good performance and minimal effort by leaning on the vast number of C libraries that already existed to implement that functionality. Another underappreciated advantage of Python, a bit like C++, is that it is promiscuous language. It isn't so in love with its purity that it won't happily do slightly dodgy things to hook up with things that were never intended to work together. It may not be pretty, but you can actually make it work, and the language doesn't try to prevent it. As time went on, a school of thought emerged that you could efficiently do almost anything you needed to do in software engineering with a combination of Python and C++. There is definitely an element of truth to that, and the ease with which you can combine those languages made them common bedfellows in practice. Python initially won because it was better for writing complex software than Perl, but its staying power was based on its easy integration with literally everything. Greater than Python was much more scalable and maintainable language than Perl. This is a really excellent point. We were a Ruby/Golang shop, and out of nowhere one of the sales engineers starts writing scripts in Perl. He wrote some really useful stuff, but the downside was that it was incomprehensible gobbledygook baked into 4 or 5 lines, and completely unmaintainable by anyone other than the original author. After he left, we decided to rewrite all his code in Python/Ruby based on the general idea of what we wanted the inputs and outputs to be, rather than assign anyone to maintain the actual Perl code. Versus the 8-year-old analytics/data science codebase I had to unwind a couple years back, was written entirely in Python and was easily understandable from the first line and had been maintained by no less than 6 people over that time. There was a brief period of schools teaching Java compiling down to CLI programs in Unix, Beans. Perl was popular on the semiconductor world, replacing TCL for gluing together complex manufacturing flows. Ruby was heading to be a replacement for Perl with bidirectional file handles and similar syntax. Shell scripts and Perl are still on use there. Python never made inroads because it brought nothing new and was less suited to file munging than Perl. Perl still has superior text manipulation semantics compared to Python. What concepts does a language force a new user to be aware of, and how reliable are users' first intuitions about those concepts? I would argue that Python dominates Ruby in this metric. New users wonder how to call functions. They form an intuition, use parenthesis, but it's unreliable. Oh, parentheses are optional. Oh, parentheses are only optional sometimes. New users wonder what a function is exactly. They form an intuition, but their initial intuition doesn't encompass all 7 different types of callables in Ruby, so many surprises and frustrations await. Python is much more boring in this respect. Users are more likely to form accurate intuitions. What follows is my subjective experience as I came to like Python but hate Ruby. I learned Python in the mid-2000s while trying to script Asterisk. Asterisk had an existing community around PHP and Ruby, so I looked at Python, PHP, and Ruby with fresh eyes. Python appealed to me most. I remember being very confused about what Ruby gems were. I thought they were something like Java EE that I'd heard about in passing at school, some kind of compiler plugins or something complicated. Python had libraries though. I knew what they were. I didn't seek out learning materials for the languages, I only saw how people were talking about them in the Asterisk community. I'm sure the right material would have explained what a gem was very well, but those obscure mailing lists I was reading did not. I never did give Ruby a fair shake, so don't take this as advice. These were merely my experiences as a new programmer looking at both languages with fresh eyes. I'd argue that better relative ergonomics had diddly squat effect on Python's current position. Its first mover advantage, plain and simple. It got its hooks in data science like JavaScript got its in the browser. I can say that personally, using Ruby, Python felt like a massive step backward. I can see how others might disagree, but I feel like it's all in what you know first. On a certain level, most of us know JavaScript is just terrible, but there have been millions of new devs who knew nothing else and thought it's fine, better than fine, it's great, it's the other stuff that's weird. But then you go on for a while, maybe eventually find Lisp or functional programming, and you realize how brain damaged our most commonly used tools really are. Greater than new users wonder how to call functions. They form an intuition, use parenthesis, but it's unreliable. Oh, parentheses are optional. Oh, parentheses are only optional sometimes. Printf sure, you need parenthesis to call a function in Python. Greater than Python is much more boring in this respect. Users are more likely to form accurate intuitions. Is defining a class the same as defining a function? What about functions implicitly defined when you define a class? Underscore what underscore is underscore with underscore underscore some underscore words underscore. Why do you need an empty file called init.py in the same directory as your actual code? It is sad to me that you hate Ruby. It is a better language than Python for my taste in all dimensions except number of libraries available. To begin with, I could never understand why there need to be those global functions in Python to do meaningful things with lists. In Ruby the everything is an object really works down to every nut and bolt and is clean and very conceptually pleasing. Whether you call a package a gem, module, jar or whatever isn't very central. Yes, it's essentially UI/UX principles as applied to language design, with developers being the users. You want your users to be able to build reliable mental models of your interface. 1. The optional parentheses example is a good one. That mistake was carried over to Crystal. It's such a silly little inconsistency that I'm sure the designers considered cute or clever. It's naught but a constant pain in the butt. Another good example is YAML versus JSON. I understood the entirety of JSON syntax pretty much immediately upon seeing it. It's trivial. YAML is supposed to be easier for humans, but by foregoing a uniform and consistent syntax it ended up an order of magnitude harder. 1. I first encountered Python around 2000. At the time Perl was more popular in the circles I frequented, and TCL probably about as popular as Python, Eggdrop 1, notwithstanding, but Python was growing steadily. I encountered Ruby in the late noughties. As others have noted, it made its English language debut almost a decade after Python started, and Lua was another contender during this time. My memory is that, at least outside of the web/raw world, Ruby at no point as popular in the US as Python. Let's take, say 2005 as a point that Ruby was really gaining popularity due to Rails. At this point I was already seeing internal tools that previously would have been written in Perl being written in Python. Python just seems to have maintained a certain momentum, and I'm not sure why, but if I had to guess. 1. The syntax is almost a dead ringer for pseudocode. The first time I encountered Python, I fixed a bug in an open source project having never seen Python before. I recall 2 different CS programs, switched to Python from Scheme for exactly this reason. 2. It was designed to glue C together. Other languages were too, TCL and Lua. Perl primarily interfaced with the outside world in the same way Shell does, with pipes. 3. A kitchen sink approach to the standard library helped it a lot for the first 20 years of its existence. CPAN was so generous at the time for installing libraries, so the more you could do without relying on third-party libraries, better off you were. 1. I think it upset the Perl hegemony in part because of the enterprise infatuation with object orientation. Perl got a lot of flack from the Java/XML crowd. Perl's not a real language, it's not object-oriented. You could kind of write Java in Python, and thus a certain kind of enterprise techie couldn't dismiss Python as just a scripting language. Greater than the syntax is almost a dead ringer for pseudocode. This is the big one. You look at it, and you think you know what it's going to do. The indentation rules also means things look predictable rather than being a mess of brackets.
Hey guys, this is the Rogue YouTuber here. I recently had a big change in my life. I had a baby daughter. Here she is. If you could do me a favor and remember to hit the subscribe button and bang the bell, I'm hoping to really create a YouTube channel that really gets people excited and brings people the best, most interesting content collated from across the internet. I'm saving up to save my little girl to Carnegie Mellon Computer Science Department. So please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.